Welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today we're joined by a very special guest, and we are back to the realm of philosophy, discussing a bit about Plato, the theory of forms, and whether the human sort of condition, what is it? Do we have a soul? Is there an afterlife? And we'll be tackling all these questions alongside Max.
So, so yes, today we are joined by Max, a theology and philosophy of religion student at Cambridge. So it is great to have you on today, Max.
Thank you for having me, gents. Looking forward to it.
So firstly, let's explore perhaps the idea of the theory of forms. So firstly, Max, can you explain to our listeners what this is and how relatable would you say it is to our modern day understanding of the world?
Yeah, so the theory of forms is arguably what sort of Plato is best known for. It's this idea that he splits the world up into the sensible realm and the intelligible realm, and so stuff we perceive, and then stuff that can only really be grasped through our mind and through reason. And the theory of the forms is essentially the top of the intelligible realm. It is the end goal, effectively, for all people, and you have forms which other things participate in. So if we say someone is good, what we really mean is that person participates in the form of goodness or the
Yeah.
form of beauty. Now, whether there is an intelligible realm with these forms in, most people would probably argue no. But if you think of religions, for example, if you think of Christianity, you might argue that God is the source of goodness and God is the source. In fact, you probably would argue this, right? So, theory of the forms, literally, probably not, but that doesn't mean they're not helpful. That's my opinion, anyway.
Also, another sort of very well-known theory by Plato is the allegory of the cave. Um, could you first tell us how this links with the theory of the forms and just explain a bit sort of the context and what it actually tries to explain?
Yeah, so the allegory of the cave is probably Plato's most famous piece. I know sort of the theory of the forms broadly, but the allegory of the cave, really is sort of what he's most known for. It's basically an explanation of the theory of the forms, where you've got, as I'm sure you gents know, but for those that don't, prisoner trapped in a cave, and they perceive reality to be the shadows of the puppets behind them in the cave, and one of them escapes and goes up and goes out the cave, and he's dazzled by the light, and he sees he sees that actually there's so much more to the world than what he perceived before, and actually his reality, what he thought reality was before, was just basically shadows and shadow games. The question of how, how do we apply this to modern day issues, Dejan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you say issues, can you just as in problems, or like can you just further elaborate on that a little
Yeah.
bit?
What I would say is how sort of does the layman, the average person, how can they learn from the allegory of the cave, if they can learn from the allegory of the cave?
Yeah. I mean, for me, they absolutely can, whether you're religious or not. The allegory of the cave is, you know, argues that we should shift our focus from materiality and corporeality and sensibility over to, sort of the mind and pleasures that go beyond our body, effectively. And I'm sure you've heard the term sort of higher pleasures before,
Yeah.
in your studies of philosophy, but that is sort of what it is. The pleasures of the mind are the sort of higher pleasures. So I think it's really important, because I do think that sometimes if you focus too much on, well, materiality, but also corporeality, you can get down a pretty troublesome road. It's important to an extent, but if you focus on it, I think things like greed and other things can become your end goal, which I think is not a healthy or fulfilling way to live your life. But that's, like I say, just my contention.
Yeah, I agree with you there, because I think there's that idea of like this world of forms and of these sort of like ideas and concepts which just don't change. And if you seek pleasure, let's say, in like I don't know, beauty. I mean, that could be like beautiful art or something. But even though that is a material thing, that's a far nicer sort of pleasure, higher pleasure to derive than, let's say, material consumption and things like that. And so I think, yeah, I think also like anyone can just sort of access almost their own world of forms, and that is leaving all this material world. I mean, you know, the world almost seems, increasingly material. Also, everything's sort of about like a brand, or these are like the way the modern world is constructed. So I think focusing almost like on the higher pleasures, you can really just sort of unlock almost like a deeper state of happiness from that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I fully agree with you there, John, as well. I think it's especially difficult today with the sort of consumerism happening in
Yeah,
developed society. Everyone's sort of every sort of couple of weeks there's something you need to buy something for. It's like, oh, if Christmas is coming, I need to buy something, like Valentine's Day in Feb, like 2 months later. Then you've got Easter. Then you've got, like, I don't know, like Children's Day on the 1st of June. Exam results in August.
yeah,
And then it's sort of this cycle where every 2 months you need to buy something, let alone birthdays, weddings, whatever. So if we're kind of trapped in this cycle of going and buying things, maybe we should just take a step back and focus a bit on stuff we can't buy.
Mm.
Because these sort of things that Plato's talking about, these higher pleasures, you can't really buy them, I don't think. It's more of a, you can put your time and that's about it, and you can experience it, but you can't actually make a sort of transaction.
I think as well, it's what makes this such an attractive concept is, I'm sure you've heard the term universality and
yeah,
what that entails, but effectively it comes down to the issue that the theory of the forms is accessible to all. It doesn't require necessarily a belief in God or in other things. You can just, condition your body effectively. I feel that has negative connotations. It doesn't need to, though. You can condition your body into focusing on these higher pleasures, and you don't need anything else to do that. So yeah, that's another sort of really attractive thing about the theory, in my opinion. I'm not sure what you two think about that, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's it's one of the positives of it. It's quite free for people to subscribe to. It doesn't require any sort of larger commitment
Mm.
in some way, which I think is helpful. Um, so moving on now, um, we know so your dissertation is based on the Phaedo, which is one of Plato's dialogues. Could you first tell us what the Phaedo mainly is in a couple of sentences as a sort of short summary?
Yeah, so it's towards the beginning of the middle works of Plato, and it's effectively his thesis on death. It's not all there is to it. He also looks at sort of the immortality of the soul in it, but especially what I'm focusing on is what he thinks about death, why he thinks it. Yeah, that's effectively the Phaedo in a nutshell.
oh yeah. So I mean, you mentioned there this idea of the immortality of the soul, and in many ways, whenever I've only really heard of the Phaedo, not many times before, but I sort of heard of it in the same sentence as this idea of the soul being immortal. So it's quite a big question, but do you think the soul is this immortal thing after death? I mean, Plato obviously does. Do you think there's any, weight behind his argument?
Yeah, this is the fantastic thing about, well, not just Plato, but about philosophy generally is, I could turn around and go yeah or no, but the real question is, what do you mean by the soul? Right?
Oh
Like,
yeah,
what is the soul? And this is an unanswerable question, right? People will give you, it's what makes you helpful, right? Like, what does that mean? But I mean, my faith tells me of a resurrection after death. So, is that the soul? Maybe, probably a helpful way to understand it. Um, so, do I think the soul is immortal? Potentially, but I do believe there is a resurrection after death. Therefore, yes is probably the easiest answer, but I think it can vary, and I think I wouldn't say a belief in the soul is actually necessary for it, because whether or not you believe in the soul, like I said, I believe in a resurrection, therefore I would probably say yes to this question. What do you gents think about it, and why? I'm interested.
Yeah, I agree with you, Max. I mean, mainly again because of this sort of faith that we happen to share, and again, I think it's the resurrection is very difficult to sort of justify in a way without justifying the soul first.
Mm.
I think it's so if you need both in order, you need one in order for the other to happen in some way.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's sort of coming from like an agnostic sort of point of view. But for me, whenever I think about the soul, it just leads more. It leads to more questions in my mind. Obviously, as you said, what is the soul? I mean, I don't believe it in the sort of, I guess you could say the bit of the holistic sense of it, like as you said, of who you are. But I think there's part of you, and I remember Diane, he talked about it a few weeks ago, actually with Max, and you mentioned how it was sort of built up throughout your life. And I think that idea of the soul does seem sort of quite reasonable in a way. It's something that's part of you, which is built as you are, almost as you grow. But then for me, whenever I think of the soul, it's just obviously what is it? We don't really know. And secondly, where does it go? As in, so you mentioned obviously the soul being resurrected. I mean, does that sort of go to, some kingdom elsewhere? Is that like, does the soul perhaps, go to another form of life? I mean, what do you guys think about the resurrection and how it links to the soul?
Well, I think how it links to the soul is sort of what I explained earlier
Oh,
about it kind of being the same. Well, perhaps a pseudonym. Like Christians will debate whether that's the case, but I think in regards to the resurrection, uh, it's a really tough one, because we don't really, obviously we don't know. It's to do with death, right? Like, and it's one of those things in science can tell us very little about. But as I explained, my faith, which I hold firm, tells me of a resurrection, and therefore if that means the soul, then sure. You know what
yeah,
I mean? There you are.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think sort of the bigger contention I think when it comes to resurrection is whether there is actually a physical resurrection. I think
yeah,
that's a bit more contentious. But I think it's very difficult because again you can't really be sure.
Mm.
But sort of belief that I have is that it goes to sort of Dantean paradise.
Mm.
But you can't know. I think the bigger contention there is, do we have a sort of physical bodily resurrection? I don't know.
In regard, but John, for example, you mentioned like kingdom,
oh
like a
yeah,
particular, where does it go after? For me, yeah, it goes
yeah,
to the kingdom of God, right? So
yeah,
that's something I can say with surety
yeah,
that it does go somewhere afterwards. And I happen to call it one thing. Someone else might call it another, right?
yeah. Yeah, and I think, and this also it sort of reminds me of some studying A level RS of this idea of the eschatological verification and how the sort of the beauty almost of this debate is how we never really do know. There's so many angles, and you'd only really ever know if you are at the eschatology or you are where the souls go. I think that's what makes it so great to debate in a way.
Why it's called faith, John?
Yes, yeah. I mean, yeah. Do
Max,
you think? Oh,
could you also just sort of tell us a bit about sort of your road to faith?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So I was a pretty die-hard atheist at school. My philosophy of religion A level classes consisted of me vehemently arguing that it doesn't prove the existence of God, etc., etc. as listeners would have heard at the start of the podcast, I'm now studying theology at university, and there just sort of started this kind of itch. I didn't come to faith because I was, incredibly down or incredibly anxious or anything like that. It just started to sort of make sense. And it also, this is the amazing thing about faith, is faith appears or faith starts for different people in various different ways. A lot of people think that it's, a religious experience. For me, it wasn't one thing. I just, as I learned more about it, it started to make more sense. And I thought that faith was often making, excuses as to why something can, like, if you take the problem of evil and you go, how, like, surely an all good God wouldn't allow this person to murder this person. And I always thought religion was just making excuses. But actually, I did my research, and yet they are justifications with, apt reasoning. And yeah, so it just built up over time, and then it's been very recent. I, sort of has fully committed to going to church and that kind of thing, and to my faith, and to spending every day, dedicated to it. That was within the last 2 months. So it's been a very new thing. Yeah. But I was, a diehard atheist for many years.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm studying A-level RS at the moment, and I can sort of, I can see how, and I forgot who it was, but there was another scholar we sort of came across recently, and they mentioned how they almost had this journey towards faith. And it sort of, I think the idea is really interesting of how it sort of just, as you grow, it sort of just makes sense. And I think, because I'm, to be perfectly honest, I'm just not sure. As in, I think perhaps I argue against God more often just because, I don't know, maybe it seems a bit easier, but in reality, I don't really know. So maybe, I guess it's sort of, as you said, it's like perhaps an itch, which just, Oh yeah. Moving on to the Republic, so something that you've probably also looked at as well. So one of Plato's sort of key ideas in the Republic is justice. So can you perhaps explain this and also say how it's relevant to the modern world?
This is a fantastic question, because it is genuinely a question of, like, how long have you got? Because justice runs throughout the whole of the Republic, and the Republic is 10 books long. Like it's I mean, it's a fantastic question, because there's loads to unpack about it. It's brought up in chapter 1, where Plato's writing, and Socrates gets a few definitions off other people like Cephalus and Polemarchus, if that's how you pronounce it, about what justice is, and he just says, no, that's wrong, but then doesn't really give a reason. It ends in a deadlock where Socrates isn't providing an explanation, or he's not providing his own reason. He's just saying that other people's is wrong, which I find, quite funny. But then book 4 is where it really develops, because you have the description of the city, which he kind of compares to the soul. And essentially, to be sort of brief about it, when the soul is balanced, is appropriately balanced, that's a just soul. So he has 3 levels. He has the appetitive bit of the soul, which is the desire for sort of what we spoke about earlier, like money and corporeal pleasures and that kind of thing. And then you have the what's it called? We have the rational bit of the soul at the top, which is, the bit which longs for truth. And then you have the spirit, that's the spirited part below that, which is the bit which searches for honor. And then you have the appetitive, which is the bit which searches for sort of materiality, effectively. And he says, and he compares it to the city, where you've got the guardians, who are the people which search for truth, and below that you've got the auxiliaries, which search for honor, and then below that you've just sort of got the people who, aim for bodily pleasures, right? And when that's appropriately balanced within the soul, so he compares that to the soul. When that's appropriately balanced, that's a just soul. And then when it's a just soul, then justice comes from just your intuition. So it's kind of I think his definition of justice is very different to what ours. If you ask someone, if you went up to a random person on the street and went, "What's justice?" You wouldn't go, "It's they." You wouldn't. Sorry, you wouldn't expect them to say it's the appropriate sort of balancing of the soul. You go, they go, "Nah." Like that's not what you think. You'd have what sort of Kepler says in book one, where he says it's is it Cephalus or Polemarchus? Sorry, yeah, sort of living up to your legal like obligations, being honest. Polemarchus says owing friends help and enemies harm. That's probably a closer idea of what you get from the random person on the street. So it's different, but I think it's very platonic. It's the most platonic thing in the world. You wouldn't expect that definition. You wouldn't expect any other definition like that one, effectively.
So, do you think these ideas have any relevance now? Obviously, sort of our society has evolved, arguably, and sort of developed in some way or another, and is changed. But do you think these ideas still about justice and about this sort of appropriation of balance of the soul, do you think they still hold any weight today?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's a fantastic. I mean, I would say this because I've got a massive interest in Plato and I'm a big fan of him. It's a fantastic set of sort of ethics, an appropriate balancing of the soul, prioritizing the search for truth rather than and sort of not. I don't think you should totally suppress corporeality because I think it's something that makes us human, right? But you shouldn't let it rule your life. Again, sounds pretty Christian, right? And so yeah, I think it's still massively relevant and massively helpful, regardless of your belief in the soul. You know what he's trying to say, whether you believe in the soul or not. And I think it's something to yeah, it's something which can be very helpful in making you a happier person. I do believe that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what you guys think on that. Whether it's fair.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think it's sort of a bit refreshing to have that definition. It's obviously we sort of see a lot of issues now with the sort of legal justice system around the world. Maybe that's not that effective. How do you make it sort of 100% fair? How do you make it sort of that wealthy individuals don't have a massive advantage just because they can pay for a better lawyer? How do you make all of those things so that justice can actually happen? And I think this definition that Plato gives is one that can do that in some way. I think it can provide the answer to a lot of very difficult questions that we are facing at the moment when it comes to sort of justice and sort of fairness across society. I don't know what you think, John, about it.
Yeah, I mean, I quite like how it's almost on a slightly deeper level than
Yeah,
all of these sort of because we hear the word justice always as it's at the center of all our sort of like almost like societal problems, but really it is something, as Plato says, on quite almost like a deeper level. It's actually to do with you and inherently to do with you, and it is a balance. Justice isn't about more of this or more of that. Yeah, and so it is oddly refreshing in a way, I think, to think about it on this sort of deeper level rather than just in a very political sense. Yeah.
Mm.
so now moving on to another idea that Plato sort of exposes in the Republic, which is this idea of the sort of who should rule the city. And he comes to the conclusion that it should be a philosopher king.
Mm.
First of all, could you explain why that is? And then what is this sort of philosopher king? Who are they? And do you think it's apt? Can that work?
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about sort of, yeah, Plato would say that, and it's making me sound like I don't like him. I do. It's just philosopher king to us. I think in the 21st century is probably quite an amusing idea, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, he says how philosopher kings, because of their nature, and this comes back, I mean, I think the Phaedo actually can help explain this, where it talks about true philosophers practice death, which is sort of what we've been speaking about sort of prioritizing, preparing the soul for death, where you get rid of material stuff, you just don't focus on it, and instead you focus on these higher pleasures and seeking truth. And he says because philosophers are the only ones that know how to seek truth, therefore they should be in charge. Um, I think there are some benefits to it. Um, you don't want a leader who is focused on the wrong things. You don't want someone who is overly focused on themselves or on getting money or on getting fame or on getting whatever it is. You don't want that as a leader. It's something that makes us human, but you don't want that as a priority. So I think there are some benefits to it. He justifies why is an amusing part where Adiamantus says how philosophers are useless or appear useless, and Plato goes, "No, they're not useless. They're contemplative and they're just sort of thinking about truth, but we don't understand that. Or other people don't understand that because they don't know how to seek truth. They don't know that there is a truth to seek. Therefore,
Yeah.
they appear useless to them, but actually they're not useless." Which I think is a great. Well, I think it's a justification. How effective it is, people contend. So I think there are some positives to it. But I'd be interested to see your guys' perspectives on it, because it probably does seem like quite a weird concept to the average person.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you are going to ask one of the greatest philosophers ever who should rule, it probably is slightly inevitable that he says a philosopher.
Yeah,
But
sure,
I mean,
right.
I think there's sort of like an interesting contemporary parallel you can make, and that is just because politicians today, it seems like they're in it for popularity, perhaps. There's this sense of self interest, and whilst this idea does seem a bit bizarre, a bit abstract, there's something that seems quite nice in it. How they're ruling for common good to discover truth. That seems like almost what we need, perhaps, let's say in the UK or in the USA. And so I think that does seem really attractive, this idea of someone totally not self-interested. But then, as you did say, Max, those sort of ideas of self-interest, wealth, they do almost make us human.
Mm.
So perhaps it just isn't realistic, really, this idea of a philosopher king. But, the UK's had, I guess, a series of not very good prime ministers. So maybe if a few of them focused more on philosophy, it could have turned out a bit better.
Yeah, I think the
Oh,
realism of it, and how realistic it is the most important part of it, right? Because is it possible to have someone who can rule whilst completely and entirely disregarding
yeah.
bodily wants, whatever they may be, or sort of these sort of simple pleasures? I mean, Dejan, what do you think on that, Dejan?
I'm going to be a sort of bit more pragmatic on this one than I usually am. I think it's a bit impossible to happen,
Mm.
sort of from a practical sort of perspective. I think the idea, though, is representative of something. I don't think this is one of the ideas that sort of now, at least, we should take sort of literally as what Plato is actually saying, but more of what he's actually trying to say, which is sort of the characteristics of a good ruler. This person doesn't necessarily need to be a philosopher,
Mm.
but needs to embody these characteristics of seeking truth and not being sort of malleable when it comes to this, not being easily influenced by outside factors such as wealth, popularity, uh, which I think also leads us to another sort of question, which is, can this actually be achieved with how we elect people today? Because surely the only way to get elected is to gain votes.
Mm.
That's basically a popularity contest mostly. So what do you think, Max?
Well, I think I can give my. I think you're right. I think you're correct in that. Um, it can become a popularity contest. I think Plato would say, well, the people who are voting don't know the truth, so it doesn't matter, right? Like they might be appealing to popularity, but actually they don't know what they don't know that there's a truth to be had. Therefore, their opinions don't matter. I think you'd probably say, and like I wouldn't go as far as to say their opinions don't matter, right? But sometimes people, how to say, and this isn't just politics. They vote for the person, not the politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not throwing shade at anyone in particular, but it sometimes you get caught up in the person and you love the person, but actually it might be like a potential relationship. You sort of you love the person, but actually they're not right for you, right? But it may not be. It may be what you want and not what you need, right? And I think that's a fair thing to say in the current climate.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've only really got to look across the Atlantic to Donald Trump, a man who sort of did master the media in a way. I think he's entirely concerned about popularity. That's why he does all these
Yeah.
huge rallies and all these he goes on podcasts. I think purely with the intention because to him it's a popularity contest. I mean, astonishingly, he doesn't even mind that he's like a criminal because he thinks he's more popular. I think.
I mean, he's playing the game is
Yeah.
the way, and it's what we've been talking about. And if that's what gets him elected and into power, then it may not be good, but it's the way it is, and we can't really do anything about it. We can't say people can't vote.
Yeah.
We can't just get rid of democracy, right? Like,
Yeah, I think you don't even need to look at the Atlantic. I think if you look at Nigel Farage and what he's doing in the UK with all the milkshakes and the sort of oat milk and whatever else he's talking
Yeah.
about. I mean, I haven't heard a single policy from him that is actually sort of concrete. I've heard I'm going to cut down NHS waiting lists. How?
Yeah.
Well, vote me first, and I'll tell you after. Well, that doesn't really work, I don't think. I think so. We are in a time where the major parties are losing control. We've been on this channel very critical of both Labour and the Conservatives recently.
Yeah.
Rachel Reeves is one of the favourites that comes up and up again. So people are looking for someone else to sort of come in and save the day. And in order to be that person, you need people to know you.
Yeah.
So, do we have a problem with the electoral system? Probably. But do we have an alternative? Probably not, I don't think.
But yeah.
it's a positive outlook, isn't it?
I'll say that's a mixed note to end on, but it does certainly show that Plato really is involved in absolutely everything, though. So I think he does
I
encounter.
think Whitehead, the quote I gave to you at the talk I did on the Fido, where Whitehead wrote, "All of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato," and I think it's my favourite line in the study of philosophy. And I think he's onto something there, Whitehead. So yeah.
Before we end, Max, would you be happy to just give our viewers sort of summary of the half an hour discussion? What have we talked about? This is something that people ask for, sort of more and more, to have sort of 30 seconds, 45 seconds of summary at the end so that they walk out with the sort of structure.
I will do my best. We have discussed the theory of the forms, Plato's most well-known topic, the allegory of the cave, which is simply the explanation of that. We've looked at the Phaedo, hugely important work of Plato's, and the Phaedo contains his description of death. We had to talk about that, and then just some broader views of Plato, sort of justice, and these other concepts which he just sort of chucks out, and almost buzzwords: justice, philosopher kings. What do they mean? Are they realistic? And I think what we haven't sort of talked about, but I think people, listeners, whoever, can gain a sense of, is the link between Plato and theism. And I think that's something that I think everyone should study Plato, but I would say that. But I think people should go away and have a ponder about the relationship between Plato and theism. Can we call him a theist? But yeah.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. Also fantastic to have you here with us today. And hopefully we'll reunite in some time for another sort of philosophy-based episode. I think it was a great discussion. One of the best so far, definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, gents. Really appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone for listening as well. And also a big thank you to Max. And everyone, please do follow the podcast, listen to some past episodes, and give us a 5-star rating.
Thank you, and see you next week.